Thank you so much for stopping by. Now, in case you had an opportunity to follow through the proceedings of the just concluded BRICS Summit in South Africa, then for some, I think it's very safe to conclude that the distribution of power as we know it is slowly changing. We have had a unipolar world since the end of our Cold War, late 80s, 1990 there, after the disintegration of the USSR. Remember, after the World War II in 1945, immediately we entered into the Cold War that pitted the capitalist US and its allies against the communist USSR and its allies, and so that lasted. And to be honest, when you see how when you see the politics and the alignments in the world politics, sometimes you wonder if this Cold War is, really ended, because you can see quite an extension of that still going on through proxy wars and things like that. Okay, but with the BRICS and seeing how many countries even expressed interest to join it, I think this is giving the US and her allies a run for their money, and this has really and will upset the status quo. And so I think with time there will be what we call a balance of power. So that power distribution as we know it, I think that is being challenged big time. But questions as to whether the world system or world peace is much safer in a unipolar or in a multipolar system, that is a conversation we can have some other time. The reason why I made this reference is because I was just listening to some of the speeches, some of the leaders that were invited, and those who could not make it, like the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin. And he brought up an issue that he has had an opportunity to speak on time and time again, and that is the issue of supplying and even giving some countries in Africa free food, because he backed out of the Black Sea Grain Deal. So now what he was saying is, for me to, Russia is even willing to give certain African countries food for free, but on certain conditions. And not just Russia, but also Ukraine. I think at some point it was saying, we are willing to supply Africa with this, and with the grains and whatnot, but there's always conditions attached to it. It's not just Africa that has a problem with this food security. There are other countries also across the globe that also have this problem, especially with the climate change and things like that. It has really affected the production of food. So unless only for countries that have really adopted new ways of farming through technology and other means are able to really sustain themselves in terms of feeding their people. But Africa is lagging behind in terms of that. When the first sub-Saharan African country, that is Ghana, got its independence in 1957, I think food security is just one of the things that President Kwame Nkrumah talked about, that the Ghana was going to work on and ensure that her people and the country was food secure. And I think Kwame Nkrumah's speech at independence in Ghana was reiterated later by many leaders, founding fathers, as Africa continued to get its independence after 1957 going forward. And majority of it majored on the same things that Kwame Nkrumah said: food security, get rid of ignorance, make sure people are healthy, and things like that. And so many years later, maybe 66 years later, thereabout, we are still talking about food security. And this is particularly interesting because earlier on in the year, the Africa Development Bank, you can go to their website and you'll find this information, released a report that said that Africa has 65% of the world's remaining uncultivated arable land. Think about it. From all the continents, all the land in the world put together, Africa has 65% of this uncultivated arable land. of all the uncultivated land in the world that is arable. 65% is found in Africa. And on top of that, Africa has an abundance of fresh water and about 300 days of sunshine each year. And more than 60% of Africa's working population is engaged in agriculture. And of course, the soil across most of the continent is rich and fertile. This is information we have. And sometimes I wonder, when our leaders meet at the African Union, these summits they normally have at the beginning of the year, what do they discuss? You would think with this research and this information, they would sit there and try to use it and try to see how can they work around this information. 65% of the world's remaining uncultivated land is in Africa, and yet we can't feed ourselves. Food has to be used as a dangling carrot. Food has to be used as a weapon to force us to agree on things that don't suit our reality as a people. Food is being used to whip us into voting in ways that we may not be in agreement with at the United Nations. You know, food is being used as a means to players, as being used as a pawn in these proxy wars that are ongoing in the international system. And we have all this in this continent. If that is not ridiculous, I don't know what is. There's no reason why Africa, we cannot feed ourselves. Absolute none whatsoever. 65% of world's arable land, which is uncultivated, is in Africa. And then what is interesting is that 60% of Africa's working population is engaged in agriculture. But we can't feed ourselves. What is it that we're doing that is not okay? Why can't we adopt technology to help us in food production? Why can't we copy from the best practices around the world and see that this issue that is really, really important, we are able to solve it moving forward? You know, like in Kenya today, there was a shortage. I don't know if there still is, but there's a shortage of onions. So the prices have gone up, and that is because Tanzania, which supplies us with the majority of onions that we use here, I suppose, had some measures in place and some policy that curtailed the supply or the export of onions into Kenya. So now the prices of onions went up. And when you look at even Kenya, within Kenya here, there are places, there are counties that could really do well, even in terms of just planting the onions. These governors have these meetings, this governor summit that waste a lot of taxpayers' money when they organize them. There's a few years ago, I think they had one summit, and I think the agreement was for counties to sort of trade within counties and things like that. And you wonder, when they sit in these counties, do they have experts? Can they coordinate between the national government and the county governments and try to see in every county, perhaps because of the, like if you go to buy, one time I went to buy some seeds, some maize seeds, you know, and when you go to these shops, they will advise you from, depending on which area you intend to go plant that seed, they will advise you the best maize or the best whatever that can do well in that specific area. Can't we have that done in terms of other crops? Can't we have these county governments strengthening their production and their farming in certain areas that they know that does well, and they specialize on that, and the different countries. So you realize when we have this level of specialization, then some of the basic things that we need as a country can easily be sorted out. But no, we can't even do that. We can't even do that. And so we keep having them meet yearly. It's an annual meeting, this governors meeting, and they still keeping track of our devolution. It's ridiculous. These annual meetings by our governors to talk about devolution waste a lot of money, and there's never any tangible doables that we get from these meetings. So I think it's time Africa relooked at her priority. I will leave the Kenya issue just right there. No, I'll put a pin on it. But I think it's about time we really refocused and prioritized in areas that truly matter. We spend so much time in politics. At the expense of development. You cannot convince me, even here in Kenya, that we can't feed ourselves, man. I find trouble, just wrapping that around my head because of the potential and the capabilities that we have as a country, and not just here in Kenya, but across Africa. 65% of world's remaining uncultivated arable land in Africa. There's no way we can have this much wealth and we are unable to totally use it. Something is seriously wrong. And now food is just something that people use to force us into things. It's just out of order. I think we must do something about this. So I would hope that the next time our leaders meet at the African Union, there's the kind of issues, the kind of information, like this research by the African Development Bank. This kind of information is what they should be debating about. And what these leaders don't know is food insecurity. It can be another form of national security threat. Because if these people are hungry, there's not a dangerous population than that is hungry. Yeah. So food insecurity should be treated as a matter of national security. And I don't know if they learned anything from COVID-19, the pandemic, and we saw this sudden rising of nationalism from these countries, and they're just seeking to take care of themselves, and nobody cared about Africa. They cared about us after they had taken care of their people. I think the earlier that we realize that we are on our own, nobody's coming here to fix our problems. If anything, the international system has been set in a way that intends to just maintain the status quo and to the disadvantage of the global south. So the earlier we realize that, the easier and the clearer perhaps it will be for us to try to find solutions to our own issues moving forward, and that includes food security. Nobody's coming here to feed us. Nobody is coming here to provide solutions that are sustainable. They'll not do that. It is meant, how that system is set up, it is meant to ensure that you're given just enough to make you believe you're okay. You are perennially dependent on that in terms of handouts and everything else. And Africa has to wake up and realize that Africa's solutions for the African problems will only come from Africa and her people. And with that information we have from the African Development Bank, surely our leaders must act on this information as quickly as they can, put measures in place, strategies in place individually. The other regime in Kenya under President Uhuru Kenyatta, I think, had under his vision the Big Four agenda. Agriculture was part of it. Nothing much was achieved. I went through it. Very good on paper, but I don't know if it's because of the constraint of time and all that. Not much was able to be achieved at that time, but we can have this as one of our key agendas as a country, despite of who is in power. And we see that food security is something that we are constantly working to achieve and to provide for our people. And I'm hoping that would be the case for the rest of Africa, but that is just me here being very optimistic.